It's my honor to introduce Sara Eliason. Yeah. Sara is a visionary in the field of color, design, and materials. She has designed color stories for hundreds of homes, businesses, and organizations in Houston, California, and the Northwest. And she's an intuitive interior designer hailing from Alaska. But she's decided to make Houston her home. In addition to her prowess in the field of color and design, she's also very passionate about building clay houses and is leading a design initiative to influence natural building practices in Houston and beyond. Currently, Sara is designing a new restaurant concept for a Sparrow Bar plus Cook Shop, conceptualizing an indigenous farm-to-table hotel concept in Round Top, Texas, and, you know, designing spaces for 15 residential clients in addition. Please welcome Sara Eliason.
Okay, so just want to take like a quick second and absorb all of you here for a second, because this is really amazing. This auditorium is amazing. This museum is amazing. This is the community that I have been able to really grow and expand in, and being able to be here for this moment at all with all of you is just such a huge gift and an honor, and I kind of can't believe I'm here. Mies van der Rohe designed this auditorium, which is crazy cool, and really he picked my favorite flooring material of all time, so I just want to give him a huge shout out right now, which is awesome, and using two of my favorite colors in design, which is pretty much brown and black, and they do go together actually. You just want to see some value separation between the two. So I just want to give you a little tiny bit of background about what got me into this whole crazy thing of color, working with color. I've been working professionally with color for about 15 years, but really I think color is my first language, and there's a reason for that, and I think it is probably for everybody, but I think I learned the language of color far before I learned to speak. And I'm still learning to speak, so if you'll bear with me on that as well, that would be awesome. So essentially, I think that I've been really lucky in the sense that I'm not a formally trained interior designer. I am pretty much entirely self-taught, which the benefit of that means that I've developed pretty much all my own processes for the way I work with people and the way I work with environment and the way that I work with color. It also means I did everything the hard way, and it took me a lot longer to get here than maybe somebody else who'd done it a more traditional route. But what I tend to do in my work is try to really listen to what people are looking for in their spaces, in their environments, in their personal sort of bubble that we create for ourselves, and then try to translate that for them. And that's really a process of creating sort of microcosm, mini environments around us. And it's something that I think that all of us really probably do intuitively, but can learn to do better and can learn to sort of communicate with. And that's what I really want to talk to you all about today. So for me, color isn't so much something that I see, it's more something that I feel. And there's a reason for that. So really color, if you read the definition, I'm not going to try to verbatim say the definition of color, also because it's a little chunky for me. But essentially, items or objects that we see around us are not really intrinsically colored. There's light that bounces off of something, and then the rods and cones in our eyes process that, and it's actually the absence of the one color that's in the object that you're looking at that you see reflected back. That's really hard for me to understand on a science level because I'm much more of an intuitive person. But what it means basically is that this whole color thing is all perception. And if perception is reality, if we want to buy into that, then pretty much everything that we see is just our own processing, our feeling of the color of what that object is. So it's all a little bit touchy-feely, not really actually all that scientific anyway. You can get all sciencey about it, but I'm not going to do that. So essentially, if we're just really seeing color from our eyes, that means that we're processing all of the time. And we're processing before we're even really aware that we're processing. There's a really wonderful book on color called The Secret Language of Color that I was playing with getting ready for this talk. And essentially, 80% of the information that we take in that goes into our neocortex and then is processed as language and reasoning and all these wonderful things really is all visual. So it means that all of the time that we're awake and light is around us in any form, we're processing most of the information from our environment through our visual medium. That's really why color is everything, if you think about it. We're trained biologically to process all of our environment through the form of color. If you think about it in nature, our eye is trained to go to the brightest, boldest color because that's where the food is. That's where reproduction is. That's where sex and candy is, basically. And that's what we're sort of trained to look for. My greatest teacher has always been nature. And so what I want to set up for you is the idea that if we're visually processing all of the time that we're awake and all the time that we're seeing light, then really, since we've been so lucky and so brilliant to sort of shatter the idea, the concept of natural sunlight being our only source of light, and color only coming from nature, which is a pretty recent phenomenon. We used to pretty much only have access to color if we were going to color something by having to grind up really awesome little bugs called cochineal to get red, or to collect a whole lot of little saffron threads and turn it into a dye, process basically plant and minerals and nature to be able to have rare forms of color and to be able to color something. Well, we've been really, really lucky and brilliant lately in the last 100 years or so or more, and we've been able to come up with all these different sources of light that allow us to light anything all the time, 24/7, with a lot of different methods of light that are not just the sun, and then to be able to make color really, really cheap, essentially, and be able to color pretty much anything we want to color in a manufactured sense, as boldly and brightly as we possibly can color it. And so it's become basically unlimited, our access to both light and color. What that means is we're essentially processing color and light way more time in our day than we ever could have done naturally, if there is such a thing. So we're not limited anymore by the sun and when the sun goes up and when the sun goes down and seasonality and how colors change, and we sort of get a little bit of a break from color in different seasons in winter, that there's a cycle to things. We don't have to do that anymore. And even when we go home at night or we go back into our environments of quiet after we're done working for the day, we get to carry around all these awesome little devices that are really brightly lit and have tons of color on them. And so we basically just take this with us everywhere we go all of the time, and we don't limit it anymore necessarily very much. So our processors are just a little bit overtaxed. The other thing about that is that we are no longer able to sort of protect ourselves from the amount of color or the combinations of color and light that everybody else wants to use to get our attention. So if you think about it, because of living in an urban environment, we're essentially driving around all the time or working all the time in environments where somebody else gets to choose the color palette and the light for that, and they get to try to get our attention with that because that's their job. They're trying to sell us something, they're trying to teach us something, they're trying to show us something. So all day long we drive around and work in environments that maybe we haven't had a whole lot of control over, that have a ton of color and light to them. And it really adds up to, since we can't help but process if our eyes are open, a lot of visual noise, which leads me to what I'm going to call our current color crisis. I don't know if very many of you know that we are having a color crisis, but I think we're having a color crisis. because we don't get to choose how often and how much color we're absorbing and how much light we're absorbing all of the time. If you think about how you feel when you're in a natural environment, when you get out of the city, when you go to a park, when you go check out and you go to the beach for a week, or you go to a cabin in the woods for a week or something like that, there's a different regulatory system that's happening that allows you to have some downtime, some quiet, some break from color. And really what nature does is it sort of creates this whole awesome boundary system for ourselves. So nature being my greatest teacher, probably having something to do with the fact that I born in Montana, grew up in Alaska, and then spent a lot of time in California, it really influenced everything that I did. So this was equally frustrating when I was a kid. I'll explain that, because I lived in these amazingly beautiful environments. I mean, unbelievably beautiful. Alaska's awesome, right? Montana's awesome, California's awesome. But the buildings and the environments that people create in those places are not necessarily beautiful and exciting. And as a little kid, I learned really quickly that I was really influenced by environment and wanted to be an interior designer or an artist. And I just was really depressed a lot of the time, even living in Alaska, thinking, okay, these horrible, awful little boxes that people are building, this is the best we can do. Like, what a horrible tribute to nature, right? This is what we're building and designing. So I guess that's why I'm stuck with the cross to bear of building and making and designing spaces for the rest of my life. If you complain about it, you get that job. So essentially, what I've created over time of sort of looking at nature as my teacher for color is the Color Maverick Manifesto. And that's what I want to teach all of you today. So essentially, you want to think about coloring like mother. And Mother Nature always does this best, basically. There's limitless, satiating color stories in nature. It's never wrong. I dare you to find it. And if you can find a picture of a clashing color story in nature, please let me know, because I can't think of one yet. But essentially, nature uses some principles for how it deals with color and the visual environment that are somewhat protective and that always create color and visual harmony. And we can borrow some of those skills. So if you think about it in nature, and I can use a lot of different examples of this, but I'm going to start with a couple of them that I think anyone can relate to. There's always a perfect ratio of color and texture and light and intensity, and then there's a time element involved with light as well that gives us some sort of harmonious balance in our color environments. And this is really what I'm a little obsessed with. So you'll see most of my pictures have to do with these little tiny nature altars, essentially, of color, because this is what I'm obsessed with all the time. There's a balance to it. There's also essentially the biggest chunk of anything that you look at visually in nature, we're just going to use a tree for a second, is a really complex, rich neutral. That's the backbone of the story every single time in the composition. So think about the trunk of the tree, which is generally this beautiful, rich, sort of brown tone. We love browns in nature. We don't love them so much in manufactured materials. I'll go to that in a second. But the biggest percentage of color in that color story of the tree, for instance, is this beautiful, rich neutral with a texture or a matte finish. It's not something that's really shiny. That's the heart of it, if you will. It's the skin. The next layer to that, the next color in the story, in the smaller ratio leading out from that, is generally the foliage. And that gets a little brighter, a little more intense, a little glossier, drawing our eye just a little bit more. And then finally we come to the really intense color in the story, if there is one, and it's going to be the flower or the fruit. The little tiny bit of accent color that's bold, that's beautiful, that's meant to draw our eye, that's telling us where to go and where to look. And for a reason, it's communicating with us. It's telling us that's where the food is, that's where the seed is, that's where you want to go. And it's regulated by this awesome thing called light, which is always changing. And so what sunlight does naturally in nature for us is it just kind of limits us. Not only is nature telling us this is about how much color we can handle looking at, She goes a step further and she actually tells us when to look at the color and when to take a break and to stop processing. And so we see the color changing constantly because we're going to crave change, we're going to crave growth, and nature's going to take care of that by the seasonality and by the actual growth process that's always happening. And what's even better about nature, if you want to get a little more hippy-dippy, as my wife would say, then really we get to take all of the waste matter too that we're from our growth process and turn it into something new. And then you get into something really awesome like the painting I encountered when I walked in today by Morris Lewis. I believe Jay's going to correct me if I'm wrong. It was painted in 1958 called Loam, and it's upstairs on the right-hand side. Absolutely gorgeous painting about the sort of energy and movement of dirt, in my opinion, which is awesome. So that's what nature does, is it turns its waste into something useful too. But what light's going to do is it's going to essentially tell us how much color we can handle. It's going to change the color throughout the day, and as it gets time for us to sort of take a break, we're not going to see as much color in our environment anymore until we're not seeing the color at all anymore. So these are the principles that allow us to sort of digest this visual medium that's constantly happening. It's true for any biological organism. So I'm going to use people because we all like to think about ourselves in this context, and we're the ones living in an urban environment. Our bodies are no different. If you think about the ratio there, the majority of our color story is our skin, right? A little bit more matte, not so much, maybe little texture, not super shiny generally speaking. It's our rich neutral. There's a wide range of these rich neutrals out there, thank goodness. That's the bulk of your color story of our bodies. It's no different for animals. It's their fur, their skin, same thing. And then the secondary color in that story, the next more intense color or texture, is generally hair, a little bit more color, a little more texture. Look here. And then the accent, if you will, in the color story is where you're meant to look, where you're meant to connect. The eyes, the lips, the nails, you get a little more shine, a little more color, but again, it's limited. So you know what to look for, and you know where to focus your attention. And again, it comes pretty much back to sex and candy. So that's kind of, that's where our eye goes. So what that means is that, we can learn to sort of use color in the way that we are creating our environments in a very similar way to the way nature does it. The next really important sort of couple more color stories. Let me get through those first. The next really sort of transitional moment in that is I want to talk a little bit about those rich neutrals for a second. When we think about nature, or we think about our bodies, or we think about a color story, we're trying to create an environment. It doesn't really matter if we're making an environment or we're making a piece of art. It doesn't matter what our medium is. The bulk of that sort of rich neutral that we're often sort of trying to communicate or that we're comfortable living with often is skin. So it's the skin of a lot of different things. It's the skin of the tree. It's the skin of the plant. It's the skin of the earth, which is clay or soil or terroir. It's the skin of our bodies. It's this relationship that we have with this sort of breathable, protective membrane that we put around ourselves in all these different contexts. Those are generally the colors that people can live with the most. When I'm doing my work and I'm working with people and I'm trying to find colors that they can live with in their environment, whether they're going to put that on to the walls or it's a material that they're going to build with or something like that. Generally speaking, there's sort of a range of intensity we can live with in a really large plane or for a very large amount of time. You can handle a little bit more color if it's, in a room you pass through or you don't spend a lot of time in, but it's very hard to handle a lot of color that doesn't, that is in a space that you're in all of the time. These are the sort of membrane colors that we're talking about. So there's a reason why people keep gravitating to the beiges and the oranges and the browns and the grays and these sorts of colors. There is sort of a way to use them in a more exciting way, though, and the important piece is that we don't want to take the color out of the context of materiality, and that's the sort of next step in sort of the Maverick Manifesto of color. Oops, I went too far. I love this quote. soil, sorry, is the ecstatic skin of the earth. That's in a book called Dirt, which is really cool. I can't wait to read the rest of it, but I got that bit out of it. And essentially, that's what's sort of protective for us. So what we don't want to do, or at least what we want to be aware of, is that color is also, since it's a reflection of something that we're seeing, and also is something that is we're having a relationship with, is taking it out of context of materiality. We didn't have the option to take it out of the context of materiality for a really long time. We do now. So this is now where we have to become a little bit more aware of what our choices are. So we have this whole relationship with color based on what material it's in. In design, we respond naturally to the natural materials. We're talking about wood, paper, bark, clay, terracotta, tiles, any sort of plaster that's going to be clay-based, essentially, a natural paint. We're going to respond to glass, which is a natural material, metal, stone. These are the kinds of things that have a resonance with us. And those are always when we're trying to color something outside of nature, outside of these gifts, we tend to be trying to emulate anyway. And we really just want to keep looking at that and paying attention to what is that intensity of those natural materials, and how am I going to be able to bring those natural materials into a story. The same for fibers, linens, silks, cottons, things that have a natural connotation to them. When you talk about one color and you talk about it in a natural environment, and then you talk about it in terms of materiality in essentially a manufactured way, it completely changes the color. So now if we're talking about what a color feels like on drywall, or if we're talking about what it feels like in latex or plastic or a highly manufactured material, it's a completely different relationship with that color. I'm going to use orange to illustrate it because orange is essentially all wood tones. All browns are in the orange family. So a lot of times when you bring up the color orange to someone, when you're trying to find a color, for instance, to paint their walls or something like that, or a color for them to wear, if you suggest orange, they're going to most likely freak out. Most of the time they do. Orange causes a lot of anxiety for people. But what they don't realize is that all the time we're responding to natural versions of orange in the form of wood or a natural material, and that those always feel comfortable to us. So you can take it from the perspective of wood and think of orange that way, or you can think of it in our highly manufactured way and think about, for instance, I will use the illustration. I couldn't bear to show pictures of this in my slideshow because it's so unattractive to me. But if you just think about one of the largest and my least favorite home improvement giants out there, and you think about their logo for a second, or you think about caution cones or something like that that are meant to tell you something, that's a completely different experience of the color orange than what it feels like to be surrounded by wood. So you don't want to be taking color out of the context of the material that it's in. That's part of the story that you're telling. So we have this awesome ability now to sort of look at color in context of ratios that are pleasing, and light, which is pleasing, and then also the actual materiality of the color. And then the next thing that we want to focus on is feeling. So this slide on your right, your left, my right, is a palette from Arizona. All of those are clay colors. That's all just different colors of dirt, basically, which is really awesome. I have spent 15 years working with color professionally, a lot of times choosing colors from fan decks most of the time, and I have yet to find, even in the best paint companies, and there's some really cool ones, I love a lot of them, that can make a neutral as rich as what you can find in the earth. So we really haven't mastered the art of manufacturing it quite yet. We're better at it when we're using natural materials, but this is the diversity that you can see just in soil. And then on the other side we have, this is a really cool barn that I found in Glastonbury, England last year. Bear with my own photography, but we're talking about stone and wood. And I love this because this was this is the way we used to build barns. Like, this is like, think about how we build our houses now and our buildings. It's not exactly the same attention to detail, I'm sorry. It's a very different experience. And to light as well, because you're talking about the natural light that's coming in there. On this side, we have a shower that is an outdoor shower that's open air, that's stone and clay plaster, and then a detail shot of some carved stone and carved wood on a mission in San Antonio. I'm pretty much digging for natural color stories and materials everywhere I go, because this is how I learn. That's detail. The roof of the barn, that blows me away, right? I mean, that's orange. That's natural material. That's perfect texture. Same with this one. That's an inside of the shower. You're talking about a meeting of the stone and the clay plaster, and then there's actually just copper pipes coming out of the wall and terracotta tiles as the shower, sort of the hooks, if you will, coming out of the wall there. So completely different experience of bathing, right, than what most of us are experiencing every day. Very much changes what color is like for us. So we want to never take color out of the context of materiality if we really want to understand it and manipulate it well. These are a few really awesome examples of what that looks like in an actual built context, since we don't all get to have outdoor showers that are made of clay and rock. Although I really wish everyone in here did get to have that. That would be awesome. Maybe I should make that my mission. This one here is Axel Vervoort. He's a really wonderful designer that has been working through the really just natural materials with his entire career. You should look him up. He does amazing work if you don't know him already. But he does a really great job of balancing always natural plasters, woods, natural fibers only, and upholstery. It's a very different kind of resonant feeling, I think, for an environment than what we often build with. The one in the middle, I don't know the credit for this one, unfortunately, but this picture just makes me really happy. I think it's great. It shows us that you can use a little more color in the environment, but we still want to consider what we're putting the color on. So from what I can tell when I really look closely at this picture, there's still a little bit more of a plaster or a natural paint environment going on there. There's not a lot of glossy, latexy-like finishes. And we have a lot of the natural wood. Herringbone floors, again, my favorite. So that gives it this grounding, this sort of earthiness that makes it something that gives us this membrane that we can explore and play with and add color to without feeling completely overwhelmed by it. And then the one on the far right is a picture from Georgia O'Keeffe's house, and she's sort of my master of beautiful, clean, classic, modern living. Even though this is from a long time ago, this is from her house in Abiquiu. And there's only plaster walls in her house. There's no drywall. I have a little problem with drywall. And the wood and the ceiling and the floor, and then the leather, the bones, which I think are amazing. You're just seeing sort of a perfect composition of color and materiality there. This is my daughter. Now we're moving on to the next tenet of color. So the next thing you want to keep in mind when you're dealing with color or working with it is feeling and emotion. So feeling is, since really if 80% of our information that we're processing is coming in constantly, and it's coming in as a factor of light reflecting off of an object, what I want you to consider is that we are having a physical reaction to that visual stimulus before we even realize that we're in a conversation. Seeing is feeling. There isn't really any difference. You can't separate the two. And so if you're going to use color really well, you want to consider the emotion of it. Really, art always falls into the category of feeling and seeing. That's what art is. That's we're in this amazing environment surrounded by it. And so if you can kind of keep in mind what the feeling is of what you're trying to convey when you're communicating through color, that's the next thing to be aware of. Because we all do have feelings about color, even if we don't realize it. And we're constantly having them. If we're processing visually all the time when we're awake and when our eyes are open, we're constantly having an intuitive feeling response to what we're seeing, even if we're not stopping to think about it and consider it. So you want to think about what your message is and how it's getting out there, and how intense that message is. For me, I'm constantly feeling like the world is screaming at me. It's like drive around and it's like constant screaming. I can't escape it. So I've learned to protect myself with that, and I'm going to tell you how to do the same thing. But we want to be aware of the feeling that a color has. We all have sort of a natural intrinsic palette that feels good to us. Most of the time, it's the same palette that we have from childhood all the way through adulthood. There's a sort of range of colors and intensities that feels really good to us. There's a color that always makes you happy, which is why I asked you to answer that on your name tags, right? There's something that always feels good to you. Probably is the same color that made you happy when you were 5. Hasn't changed a lot. Maybe it's the same color that'll make you happy when you're 100. Let me know. Get back to me. But we have these strong emotional connections to color. There's a lot of ways to explore that and play with it. One of the great teachers that I work from taught an idea of color meditations that I like using. Something you can use with anybody and you can use yourself. But there's sort of, colors answer each other. And so when you put down a piece of paper and you take some color pastels or something like that, and you pick up a color intuitively, something that's just, you're having an emotional response to that color at that time. If you just kind of let it move on the paper, you're going to find that it's going to have a shape, an organic shape that follows the way you're feeling about that color, or that you're having an emotional response to it. And then if you put that one down and you just wait for a minute and you let yourself pick up the next color, you're going to find that the colors start a conversation with each other. They start to answer each other. This is different than a lot of times when we're trying to set up a story in an environment or a project or something like that. We tend to want to pick this color makes me happy, so I'm going to always choose red. I'm going to put red on every single element in this design or in this room or something like that. And we forget to let the color balance itself or have a conversation with something to sort of harmonize it. You'll always see perfect sort of color balance in nature. And we want to think about, what is the answer to the next color? It's always easiest to start with that candy color, that one that just feels really good to you, the accent color. But then once you've established what that is, let yourself sort of feel into what would be the next answer or the backbone color that would support that color next. And they'll begin to fill each other in. It's a little out of sequence. I think I already covered materiality, but essentially Donald Judd was writing about Joseph Albers, and I have a Joseph Albers painting in here that I'm going to show. But what he talks about is that you can't actually separate color from materiality. They're one and the same. So you always have to be thinking about that relationship. So on the right-hand side is a color meditation that I did with my kids a couple of years ago. A very bad picture of that. But you'll see that if you let little people go, they don't think a whole lot about what color means or trying to make something pleasing, but you'll find that the colors and the shapes will answer each other, which I think is really fun. Most of our great abstract artists, I think, spend their adult time trying to get back to painting like a kid, or being able to get into that intuitive process of working like a child. And then on the other side is one of my favorite masters, of course, Georgia O'Keeffe. She, to me, is one of the best translators of natural color and the color stories that are happening around us. You'll notice just a really wonderful ratio of the sort of rich neutrals leading up to slightly more intense colors, and then a little bit of the most intense color. And that makes that palatable for us. Whether that's your composition or your painter or not is sort of irrelevant. There's this sort of limiting factor there of how much color and how much shadow and light that gives us sort of a boundary to be able to experience what her message is and what she's trying to say with color without being confronted with a whole lot of intense color all at the same time, which is probably the difference between my 4-year-old and Georgia O'Keeffe. There's a little bit more neutral in there, which helps make that a little bit more palatable. Skip one. My other favorite master of this, and if you want to experience any of these principles in person, you just have to go to my church, which is right down the street. So the Cy Twombly Gallery is where you'll find me anytime I'm trying to figure out how to do something. So building up to this talk, I spent a lot of time on the bench outside the Cy Twombly Gallery. But this gallery is so important to me, and his work is so important to me, because if you go into that building, I'm sure most of you already have, and if you haven't, please put it on your list. This is one of my favorite pieces of architecture ever of all time, and one of my favorite artists for a lot of reasons. The building has perfect scale and proportion, and a perfect sort of masterful arrangement of materiality and color when you go in there. You're only talking about 3 main materials when you're in the building, and the scale is perfect for the pieces that are in there. From what I understand, he designed this building on a napkin to go with his paintings. He basically orchestrated the whole thing. It shows how brilliant the man is. Essentially, the building has plaster walls on the inside, so I want to talk about the difference between white and what white means. White in a plaster and white in drywall are 2 extremely different experiences. Just check your gut next time you look at the 2 next to each other. It's very, very different. Plaster walls, and they float to the floors, which are these beautiful wide plank wood floors. There isn't a huge color variation there. There's just a nice tonal scale balance between these different materials. There's stone and some concrete in there, and then there's absolutely breathtaking natural light. So depending on when you're in there and how you're experiencing the paintings, you're seeing something different. And then what I love even more is that the entire exhibit is one tight, gorgeous color story. So if you walk in there, you can choose to go one of 2 different directions, but you can really sort of travel an entire color story if you start from the left. It doesn't really matter which way you go, but he builds up from actually no color. It's mostly black and white and graphite paintings, all the way through stories that have just 2 colors to them and are extremely emotional, building up to this sort of crescendo in this last painting that's in this room. And I chose that picture because you can see the floors and the natural light and the walls a little bit in that picture. And that last painting is just this perfect study in sort of color balance. And it's like, in my opinion, it's an absolute symphony. It's perfect color story, that one painting. It's amazing. It smells good in there. Maybe it smells funny to you. I think it smells good. It smells like earth. The entire experience is the actual sort of, in my opinion, perfect illustration of all of these principles. This is an installation on the High Line in New York by Spencer Finch. It's really cool because essentially he went through, he was going along the Hudson River, which is, I think the Indian name for this piece is, and the river also is a river that goes both ways. But he dragged along the river one day for I think something like 700 hours. He took pictures, 1 every minute, along the water. And then he took those photographs and he took 1 pixel from each photograph, which is a slightly different color, and sandwiched it between glass and put it in these panes. And this is this big, huge installation. And it really was his sort of way of trying to represent his obsession with trying to come up with the color of water, which is sort of an impossibility. But I love this because it just shows this beautiful, colorful range of what we're trying to see, what we're trying to process when we're looking at something and trying to understand color. Joseph Albers, one of my wedding pictures. Yes, it's the same dress. This is almost a year ago. My beautiful wife is right up there. But the entire story of our wedding for me was a very intentional color story, and that builds up to the last tenet that I want to talk to you all about. When you're using color, if you can establish and understand that you're working with something that has some sort of natural limits to it, that are not limiting really, but that give us some parameters and something to start with, and you can think of it in context of materiality, you can understand that you're communicating a feeling language, an emotional language. Now you can really start to go from looking at color as an alphabet to being able to communicate with color. And it's this constant communication that we're really using all the time. We can either be aware of it and really engage in it and choose how we're going to be communicating visually all the time, or not. And this is what I notice a lot of times. It seems like we either have a tendency to overdo color and to sort of gorge ourselves on color, and meaning by that, when I say the color, I'm saying the intensity of a color, the fruit, the flower, the candy, the really beautiful, intense part. Or we have a tendency to be a little color anemic. And this is sort of my problem with the Grage movement. being sort of illustrated by certain major retailers out there. We don't really know what to do with it a lot of times, so we often use not enough color. You know, we get into this zone of, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed by this conversation that's happening all the time that I'm just going to go to black, white, and gray. Thank you very much. And this is my entire interaction that I'm going to deal with. Or we use so much color because we love it and we want more and we don't really know how much is appropriate or what feels good. But if we can start to understand the sort of balance and ratio of color that feels harmonious to people, we can really start to use it as a means of communication. And that doesn't matter what you're trying to communicate. Every day when you get up and you wake up in the world and you leave your house or even not leave your house, you're engaging in a color conversation with the world. You can't have a benign impact on the world with color. It's an impossibility. Your choices have to do with how you're communicating. I dress in color stories every day. It absolutely affects what I do all the time. I sort of organize the world by color, and I think most of us do this intuitively. But you can learn to be a little bit more aware of it and be very, very focused with your communication if you want to. I'm always taking in every single moment the setting that something's going to be in, and then what the choices are that's going to communicate what I'm trying to say in that moment through color. Because if seeing is feeling, and if we're processing before we have a chance to ever utter a word, they can't help but make some sort of have a feeling about the way you show up in a moment. So sorry, but what you wear matters, and how you design your spaces really matters. And it doesn't matter just to the people that see it, but it matters a lot to you. And I sort of challenge you to sort of use the experiment of seeing what it feels like when you change the way your color story is and what you're wearing or what your environment is. There's this visual noise that's out there all the time, and we have this ability to sort of control what our volume is and what it is that we're trying to say. So whether it's your work environment or your home, you know, how that's feeling, the actual overall feeling, whether that feels restful to you or it restores you or it stimulates you, any of those choices, those are all a choice that you can sort of control your interaction with. And it can affect the way that you're interacting with other people as well. So that's where the sort of color storying comes in. You can do it with anything. And everything should be color storied. So sort of to sum it up, if I've been able to in any way somewhat shift your perspective on color and your interaction with it, since you're using it anyway and you're going to continue to use it every single day, no matter what your work is, no matter what you do, I just want you to consider what some of the structure is of color and how you can communicate better with it. And I want you to consider what your impact is on the world with your color and how that affects you. You can sort of constructively create a little bit of a bubble environment around yourself in all of your choices, because every single choice that you're making in a day is often a color or a visual choice. You can decide how to dress yourself that provides you a little bit of sort of a sense of peace or resonance or excitement, whatever it is that you need that day to be able to help you get through it is something that you can control. And then each of your choices and how you work creatively, what you're producing out there in the world, what kind of signs maybe you're making for a business, what kind of graphic design that you're putting out into the world, all of those have a volume and a weight and a noise and an emotion attached to them that everyone else is going to be reacting to as well. And you can choose how and when to check in and how much of it you can handle. The best way for me always to organize an environment and keep it from feeling too intense or increase the intensity is to organize it by color every single time. If you've got a nice range of values and hues and intensities and materials that are resonant with people, you can always create visual harmony. It doesn't matter what the environment is. The best way, basically, to sort of change the feeling of a space, almost always, is to edit the colors down to 2 or 3 colors. You want to think about how many colors can I handle in this particular composition. You can always look to nature to sort of see what those are. But essentially, everyone leaving here today hopefully has a little bit more of an idea of how they can interact with the world in color and what their message is. And I'm asking you all to do this and become agents of curative color out there. Because it's all we see all the time. That's it.
So we have 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions, shout them out.
Yes.
What do you think, or how do you think color plays into the form versus function sort of argument about design?
Ooh. Well, I mean, I think form and function is always something that should be balanced. I think that's just, and if you're going to be creating holistic design of any kind, you should always be sort of trying to balance form and function. I'm not a big fan of things that are only beautiful or only functional. I think that's where we get into trouble most of the time. So I think color is sort of, and how to relate it to that concept, I think you want to be considering maybe with form, what is that item going to be used for? What is that choice that you're making? What is its relationship with the world, with people or the environment? How much is someone going to see it? How often are they going to interact with it? What is the function of that object? And what is its function in the space that it's in, whatever the composition is. So how, the ratio of how important it is in the context of the space and how often you're going to come into contact with it would be a big factor for me in how much color that particular item can handle. If you're talking about, a very neutral kitchen or something like that, and you're talking about your tea kettle, right? And its form and function should be beautiful, should function. How much color can you handle in that object and have it be something that makes you satiated and happy all of the time? Or in a composition, how much of it is going to be taken up by that one particular piece? Does that answer? Yes?
What is your all-time favorite color and why?
Oh, I love all colors, all of them, but I can't live with a lot of color for all of the reasons that I just talked about. So there's, like I said, I sort of live and die by the ratio of how much and materiality and what is it, how is that showing up in my life. So this is a lot of color for me. This is about as much color as I get, but it's about the sort of ratio and how much of it. I like them all, but green tends to be, greens and oranges and browns I like the best most of the time. Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned you can control your space and the color of your space, but the world is screaming at you when you're out there.
Yes.
How do you deal with that when you're out in the world? How do you protect yourself?
Yes, I probably should have said more about that in my talk, so thank you for asking that. I really work hard to sort of create a little environmental bubble around myself, and I am very, very aware of how much I'm checking in and how much I'm not checking in. I spend a lot of my interaction with the world visually sort of balancing or being aware of how much I'm taking in, because I just get overloaded pretty easily. So I love all colors, but I can't handle living with them all at the same time. I can handle a couple at a time. I don't like a lot of extra visual noise. I don't watch TV at night pretty much ever. I don't like that light and sound at the end of the day, right before I'm trying to go to bed. I spend a lot of time when I'm creating an environment, especially if it's a place I'm going to be spending a lot of time in, keeping those spaces really regulated in terms of how much color and stimulation is in there. I find that people can handle a lot of visual clutter and noise as long as it's organized by color and there aren't too many colors at one given time. So that's what often sort of changes your interaction. We can't control that we have computers and TVs and phones and visual noise and kids' toys and stuff like that in our environment. I have 4 kids, so there's nothing more chaotic than the color that is associated with kids' objects. And that's really hard. We live in 1,800 square feet. 4 children, a lot of visual noise. So I have to find ways that I can kind of contain that. Where's the kids' stuff going? Where's the spaces where my eye can rest? Because really you're just trying to give your own eye a little bit of rest. And be a ruthless editor in that way. Like, give yourself those places and those times of day when you're not being stimulated by constant visual noise, because it's really important.
You talked a bit about clay houses.
Yes.
Is that like the earth ships or?
It is and it isn't. Excellent question. So what we're trying to do with the work forward is to, so because I'm obsessed with materiality and always have been, and I'm also equally obsessed with beauty, I've come to terms with this. It no longer feels shallow. We essentially, I looked at materiality of natural building methods for a long time, and I went, okay, this is really awesome and it's life-changing, and I challenge any of you, if you ever get a chance to go and spend a night or something like that, or some time in an environment that is made of entirely indigenous natural materials, it will change the rest of your life. It's nothing short of a spiritual experience. And I've had that opportunity, which is awesome. And because of that, and because of just my gut telling me this is important, this is the way forward, what I started to realize is that there's a lot of really cool natural building methods out there that use natural materials and get the effect done. They get to the function part that you were talking about, but they don't really have a whole lot of form that most people can connect with and resonate with. And so what we're trying to do is be able to use those methods in a way that is really beautiful. Everybody has a different idea of beauty. I tend to find that simplicity is huge, like most people can resonate with simple, beautiful, but that we need it to also be visually pleasing in order to really connect with the material and the medium. So we're trying to go forward with natural materials, but in slightly more classic architectural forms, so that if an earthship isn't the way you plan to live in Houston, that you have a way to sort of still connect with natural materials in your environment. So there's a lot of ways to do that. It's not an impossible task, but we do have to start making different choices about how we're building and how we're designing.
I'm a graphic designer, and in the past couple of years, we've moved toward a trend of what's called flat design, where it's like you use bright colors and you don't add any depth, and it's just it's like typography, and then a bright color, and then usually there's something else. Being an interior designer and recognizing these neutral colors being more, there needs to be more appreciation for neutral colors.
Absolutely.
And with most social media sites, we use bright colors, like bright blues and bright reds. How do you think your trade, your skill, can help graphic designers bring a more neutral and bring more depth back into graphic design?
Well, from the other side of the graphic design question, because I'm seeing what you're producing, right? I'm not producing what you're producing, but I'm seeing the effect of it. I totally understand from the graphic designer's perspective that designing in the way that you're talking about is extremely effective. It gets my attention, it gets everybody's attention, and isn't that really what's happening out there, is we're all being, someone's always trying to get our attention, and there's sort of a race and a competition to see who can get there first and who can get it the best, and that's what sells something. So the flip side of that, though, is that that's very, very stimulating and very taxing for people to live with. And it is that sort of noise that makes us feel a little bit stressed out all the time, and we're not even really sure where that source of stress is coming from. I swear that we're all kind of walking around just feeling a little tight, just a little too tight because of what we're constantly processing. So I think, you know, if you think about the way graphic design looked 100 years ago versus the way it looks now, you would have seen a whole lot less color and a lot more sort of neutrals. And part of that was just that we didn't have the technology. We didn't have the ability to produce color cheaply, but like we do now. But there is sort of, I'm personally going to respond a whole lot better if you're not screaming at me than if you're just talking to me nicely in a beautiful way. So I challenge people to kind of maybe look at graphic design even a little bit differently. But what it means for us on the other side of the coin is that we're really having to change environment to sort of measure, to match and to measure and to handle the amount of color stimulation that's being thrown at us all the time. So and that's a good and a bad thing, I think. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I do still really negatively react to what I feel like there's a lot in the design movement to sort of use hardly any color, because I think what's happening is people are so overstimulated that they don't really know what to do with environment, and they're just feeling wound too tight all the time, so they just kind of opt out. And so we get a lot of environments now that just have an absence of color and materiality, it feels like to me. You know, it's very, very hard in our work to bring in a whole lot of color and noise, whether it's in any sort of graphic design, it's art, it's medium. And if you try to drop that image, that visual communication into a space that's got some beige carpet and some white drywall and, you know, no natural materials whatsoever and no color in the baseline, it's extra noisy. It makes your contribution even louder. So what I try to do with my work is to sort of increase the color and materiality of the baseline. If I do that, if I bring enough sort of richness and depth and resonance and color into the baseline of an environment, then you can bring me that flat color, you know, sort of input, and it's going to look okay in there. It's not going to overwhelm me. And so it's having to change how we live in our environments to be able to sort of live up to the noise that's coming in constantly. If I can make a room that has a whole lot of wood in it and clay and plaster or rich neutrals that are way more interesting looking neutrals than, you know, a beige paint color or a gray paint color, then that noise is not going to be so loud. It's going to be sort of balanced in sort of overall composition of things. Does that make any sense? That's good.
Well, we're all out of time for questions, so please give her another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was awesome.